There are moments in royal history when power does not announce itself. It simply shifts, quietly, decisively, and often long before the public fully understands what has already been set in motion. And right now, a growing conversation is forming around a possibility that could reshape how titles, legacy, and authority are understood within the British monarchy, especially when the names Queen Camilla and Diana, Princess of Wales, are placed back into the same sentence. Because according to reports, discussions, and long-standing speculation among royal watchers, there is a theory that one future decision by Prince William, the future king, could trigger a chain reaction affecting multiple titles currently associated with Queen Camilla. And while nothing has been officially confirmed, the structure of royal authority makes one thing very clear: titles are not permanent possessions, they are granted, defined, and ultimately controlled by the crown itself. Now think about this carefully, because this is where the entire conversation becomes far more serious than a simple headline, since within the British monarchy, every title, from Her Royal Highness to Queen, exists not as a personal asset, but as a constitutional designation that can be altered, limited, or removed under specific authority, and that authority sits with the reigning monarch. And this leads to a powerful question for you. If titles are granted by the crown rather than owned by individuals, how secure are they when leadership changes? Because this is exactly where the focus shifts toward Prince William, the future king, whose eventual accession would not simply represent continuity, but control over titles, roles, structures, and the public presentation of the monarchy itself. And just when it seems like this is purely theoretical, history provides a precedent that makes the discussion far more grounded, because in 1996, following the divorce from King Charles III, the title Her Royal Highness was removed from Diana, Princess of Wales, through formal letters patent, a single decision that instantly changed her position within royal protocol. Now pause for a moment and consider the significance of that, because if a title of that level could be removed during one moment in history, it raises the possibility that titles could also be redefined or restored under different leadership, especially if the future monarch sees symbolic or institutional value in doing so. So let me ask you directly. Do you believe royal titles reflect fixed identity, or do they reflect the decisions of whoever holds the crown at that moment? Because insiders often describe the monarchy not as static, but as adaptive, meaning that each reign brings subtle shifts in how authority is expressed. And this is where the conversation around Prince William becomes even more relevant, since Prince William is frequently associated with a more structured and clarity-driven approach to institutional identity. And that is where the tension begins to build, because if a future monarch prioritizes clarity, consistency, and public trust, then any perceived ambiguity surrounding titles, roles, or historical narratives could become a focal point for change. Now think about this carefully. If a future king decides to redefine how titles are presented, would that be seen as correction or as disruption? Because as this discussion grows, another layer begins to emerge, one that goes beyond individual titles and moves into the broader concept of legacy. Since the legacy of Diana, Princess of Wales, continues to hold a unique emotional position in public perception, while the position of Queen Camilla represents the present structure of the monarchy. And when those two narratives intersect, even hypothetically, it creates a level of interest that goes far beyond protocol, because it touches on identity, history, and the emotional connection between the monarchy and the public. Now consider this. If legacy and authority ever move in different directions, which one do you think ultimately shapes the future of the monarchy? Because as we move forward, one thing becomes increasingly clear: this is not just about titles, this is about control, about who defines what those titles mean, and about how the next era of the monarchy could quietly reshape what the public has come to accept. And this leads directly into what comes next, because if the structure of royal titles is more flexible than it appears, then the real question is not whether change is possible. It is how far that change could go once a new monarch holds the pen. So before we move into the deeper layers of this story, think about this carefully. Are we looking at a hypothetical scenario that will never happen, or are we looking at a system where everything depends on one future decision? Because what comes next is where the theory begins to feel a lot more real. And just when the conversation begins to center on whether titles can truly change, the story takes a more revealing turn, because insiders are not only discussing if change is possible, they are outlining how that change would actually unfold under the authority of Prince William, the future king. And once you understand that mechanism, the entire situation stops feeling hypothetical and starts feeling procedural. Because within the constitutional structure of the monarchy, the most powerful tool available to a reigning sovereign is not a public speech or a media announcement, but a formal instrument known as letters patent, a legal document that defines royal titles, ranks, and styles. And it was through this exact mechanism that Diana, Princess of Wales, lost Her Royal Highness styling in 1996 following the divorce from King Charles III. Now think about the significance of that, because one signature, one document, and one decision altered the entire position of Diana, Princess of Wales within royal hierarchy, which means the same mechanism could, in theory, be used again under a future monarch to redefine titles in a completely different direction. And this leads to a critical question for you. If a system allows titles to be removed through a formal process, does that same system inherently allow them to be reinterpreted or even symbolically restored? Because this is exactly where the speculation surrounding Prince William gains momentum, since Prince William, as the future king, would hold full authority over how titles are structured during his reign, including how historical figures are recognized within the monarchy's evolving narrative. But here's where the situation becomes even more complex, because while the restoration of a styling like Her Royal Highness for Diana, Princess of Wales is often discussed in symbolic terms, the implications of such a move would extend far beyond symbolism, potentially influencing how current titles associated with Queen Camilla are perceived and positioned. And that is where the tension begins to rise, because if one figure's legacy is formally elevated, even symbolically, it can shift the balance of narrative within the monarchy, and narratives, especially in institutions built on tradition, carry more weight than they appear to on the surface. Now pause for a moment and consider this. If a future monarch chooses to highlight one legacy more prominently, does that automatically reposition others within the same historical framework? Because insiders suggest that the monarchy is not only a system of governance, but also a system of storytelling, where titles, roles, and public presentation combine to create a coherent narrative that the public understands and engages with. And just when it seems like this is purely about perception, another layer emerges, because titles like Queen, Queen Consort, and Her Royal Highness are not interchangeable labels. They define rank, protocol, and precedence within both ceremonial and constitutional contexts. And this is where Queen Camilla becomes central to the discussion, because the current titles held by Queen Camilla exist within the framework established during the reign of King Charles III, meaning that any future changes in that framework would depend entirely on how the next monarch chooses to interpret and apply those structures. Now think about this carefully. If titles are shaped by the priorities of each reign, how different might the monarchy look under a future king compared to its current form? Because this is where Prince William is often described as representing a shift toward a more streamlined, clearly defined monarchy, one where roles are less ambiguous and where public perception aligns more closely with institutional structure. And that leads to another important question. If clarity becomes the priority, what happens to titles or roles that are seen as historically complex or publicly debated? Because as this discussion unfolds, one thing becomes increasingly clear: the potential for change is not limited to one title or one individual. It is part of a broader framework that allows each monarch to shape the identity of the institution during their reign. And just when it feels like this is still a distant possibility, the timeline becomes relevant, because succession within the monarchy operates instantly, meaning that the moment a new sovereign takes the throne, authority transfers completely, and with that authority comes the ability to redefine structure without delay. Now consider this. If change can happen instantly at the moment of succession, how prepared do you think those decisions are before that moment even arrives? Because insiders often suggest that future monarchs are not making decisions in isolation at the moment they ascend. They are forming perspectives, priorities, and potential strategies long before that day comes. And this leads directly into the next phase of the story, because if the mechanisms for change are already established, and if the authority to use them is guaranteed, then the real question is not whether change is possible, but how those mechanisms might be used to reshape the monarchy's identity. So before we move forward, think about this carefully. Are we looking at a system that preserves tradition exactly as it is, or are we looking at a system that quietly evolves with each new monarch? Because what comes next is where the theory begins to move closer to reality, and once we step into that layer, the implications become far more significant than they appear at first glance. And just when the mechanics of titles begin to feel clear, the story shifts into a more uncomfortable territory, because insiders are no longer just discussing how titles can change. They are asking what those changes would actually mean in real life for Queen Camilla the moment Prince William, the future king, assumes full authority over the crown, and this is where the theory begins to feel personal rather than procedural. Because within royal structure, titles are not simply ceremonial labels. They control access, influence, visibility, and even daily function, meaning that any adjustment to titles can ripple across everything from public appearances to internal hierarchy, and this is exactly why the conversation around potential changes feels so significant. Now think about this carefully, because the moment Prince William becomes king, the entire system recalibrates instantly, not gradually, not over months, but in a single constitutional shift where authority transfers completely, and that authority includes the ability to redefine how every senior royal is positioned within the institution. And that leads to a powerful question for you. If one moment can completely reset the structure of authority, how much of what we see today is actually temporary? Because insiders often describe succession as the monarchy's most decisive moment, the point where continuity is maintained, but control is entirely refreshed, and that refresh allows the new sovereign to align the institution with a different vision if desired. And this is where the contrast between reigns becomes critical, because while King Charles III has approached the monarchy with a balance of tradition and gradual adaptation, Prince William is frequently associated with a more streamlined and clarity-focused model, one that prioritizes fewer working royals, clearer roles, and stronger alignment between public perception and institutional structure. Now pause for a moment and consider this. If the future king values clarity above complexity, what happens to roles or titles that exist in a more ambiguous space? Because this is where Queen Camilla becomes central to the discussion again, not as an individual, but as a position within a system that may be redefined under new leadership, especially if that leadership seeks to simplify and modernize how the monarchy is presented. And just when it seems like this is purely about internal structure, another layer emerges, because public perception plays a significant role in how the monarchy evolves, and the legacy of Diana, Princess of Wales, continues to influence that perception in a way that remains uniquely powerful even decades later. And this creates a dynamic that is difficult to ignore, because when legacy and current structure intersect, especially in a public institution, the pressure to reconcile those narratives can become a factor in how future decisions are shaped. Now think about this carefully. If legacy continues to influence public emotion, and authority controls institutional structure, what happens when those two forces move in different directions? Because insiders suggest that this is exactly the kind of tension that future monarchs must navigate, balancing respect for history with the need to define the institution for a new era. And this is where Prince William is often described as preparing for a monarchy that is more focused, more deliberate, and more aligned with modern expectations, which could naturally lead to a re-evaluation of roles that do not fit neatly within that vision. But here is where the story becomes even more layered, because any change, even if procedurally simple, carries symbolic weight, and symbols within the monarchy often carry more influence than formal announcements. And that leads to another important question. Do you think the monarchy is shaped more by legal decisions, or by the meaning people attach to those decisions? Because as this conversation continues, one thing becomes increasingly clear: the potential changes being discussed are not just about titles themselves, they are about what those titles represent within a system that is constantly balancing tradition and evolution. And just when it feels like this remains in the realm of theory, the reality of succession brings it closer to possibility, because succession is not a distant concept, it is a certainty within the structure of the monarchy, and with that certainty comes the inevitability of change, whether subtle or significant. Now consider this: if every reign reshapes the monarchy in its own way, how different do you think the next version of that institution could look compared to what we see today? Because as we move into the next phase of the story, the focus begins to shift from what could change to what would change first, and that is where the implications become even more specific, even more detailed, and far more difficult to ignore. And what comes next is not just about possibility, it is about priority. And just when the conversation begins to feel like a theoretical exercise in royal mechanics, the story takes a sharper turn, because insiders are now focusing on something far more tangible: the specific areas where authority, once transferred to Prince William, the future king, would begin to express itself first. And those areas are not symbolic, they are structural, visible, and immediate for figures like Queen Camilla. Because according to constitutional practice and internal royal procedure, the first changes after succession are rarely dramatic announcements. They are operational adjustments, the kind that quietly redefine who appears where, who signs what, and who represents the crown in daily function. And that is where the real shift begins. Now think about this carefully, because the moment Prince William becomes king, the official order of precedence, the structured hierarchy that determines ranking within the monarchy, resets instantly, placing Prince William at the top, followed immediately by Catherine, Princess of Wales, also known as Kate Middleton, as the new queen consort. And that single shift alone begins to reposition every other senior royal within the system. And this leads to a powerful question for you. If hierarchy defines visibility, influence, and ceremonial importance, how much does position matter once that hierarchy changes? Because insiders suggest that one of the first visible changes would appear not in law, but in presentation, specifically in official records such as the court circular, where engagements are listed daily in order of precedence, and a shift in that order immediately signals a shift in status. And just when it seems like that is a minor detail, the reality is far more significant, because the court circular is not just a record, it is a public reflection of institutional structure, and a movement down that list is not just symbolic, it is structural. Now pause for a moment and consider this. If someone moves from second position in a national record to a lower position overnight, does that change feel gradual, or does it feel immediate and unmistakable? Because this is where the impact on Queen Camilla becomes more visible, since current positioning alongside King Charles III would no longer apply once authority transfers, and positioning would instead be determined entirely by the new monarch structure. But the shift does not stop at visibility, because insiders highlight another area where change would be immediate: ceremonial roles, the structured participation in state events such as Trooping the Colour, state opening of Parliament, and remembrance services, all of which are carefully choreographed according to rank and designation. And this is where the transition becomes even more noticeable, because participation in these events is not automatic, it is assigned, meaning that under Prince William, the future king, every role, every position, and every appearance is subject to review. Now think about this carefully. If ceremonial roles define how the public sees the monarchy, what happens when those roles are reassigned under new leadership? Because insiders suggest that this is where the distinction between active participants and invited attendees becomes critical, since former positions do not guarantee future roles, especially in a system where authority resets completely at the moment of succession. And just when it feels like this is already a significant shift, another layer emerges, because behind public ceremonies lies an entire structure of patronages, military affiliations, and institutional connections, all of which are granted under the authority of the Crown and can therefore be reassigned. And this is where figures like Catherine, Princess of Wales, also known as Kate Middleton, and Prince William would play a central role, since redistribution of responsibilities often aligns with the priorities of the new monarch, and those priorities shape how the monarchy functions on a daily basis. Now consider this. If responsibilities, patronages, and roles are all subject to reassignment, how much of a royal identity depends on the title itself, and how much depends on the functions attached to that title? Because as insiders continue to examine this process, one thing becomes increasingly clear: the transition is not just about losing or gaining titles, it is about redefining relevance within a system that is constantly evolving. And just when it feels like all visible aspects have been covered, another factor begins to emerge, one that operates quietly but powerfully, and that is institutional influence, the ability to shape decisions, participate in discussions, and remain part of the core functioning of the monarchy. And this is where the distinction between formal title and functional role becomes critical, because holding a title does not always guarantee influence, especially if structural priorities shift under new leadership. Now think about this carefully. If influence depends on access rather than title, what determines who remains central to the institution and who moves to the periphery? Because as we approach the final phase of this story, one thing becomes impossible to ignore: the potential changes being discussed are not isolated adjustments, they are part of a broader realignment that happens every time the crown passes from one monarch to another. And just when it seems like everything is already clear, one final layer remains, because beyond structure, beyond roles, and beyond titles, there is a principle that governs all of it, a principle that determines why every title exists and why every title can change. And that is exactly where the story is heading next, because once you understand that principle, everything else begins to make sense in a way that cannot be reversed. And just when it feels like every layer of titles, roles, and hierarchy has already been explored, the story reaches its most fundamental turning point, because everything we have discussed ultimately connects to one core principle that governs the entire monarchy. And once you understand that principle, the idea of titles being permanent begins to disappear completely. Because within the British monarchy, every title, every role, every honor, and every position does not belong to the individual who holds it, it belongs to the crown, and the crown itself is not a person. It is an institution that transfers instantly the moment a new sovereign ascends, which means that when Prince William, the future king, eventually takes the throne, every single title currently associated with Queen Camilla returns to that institution for review, reassignment, or redefinition. Now think about this carefully, because this is where the entire conversation shifts from speculation to structure. Since this principle is not new, it has existed for centuries, shaping how the monarchy adapts across generations, and it is the reason why titles can be granted, adjusted, or removed depending on the priorities of the reigning monarch. And this leads to a powerful question for you. If every title is ultimately controlled by the crown, how much of what we see today is truly fixed, and how much is simply temporary alignment under the current reign? Because insiders often describe succession as the moment where continuity meets control, where the institution remains the same, but the direction can change depending on who holds authority. And that is exactly why the transition from King Charles III to Prince William is viewed as more than a generational shift. It is viewed as a potential recalibration of how the monarchy presents itself to the world. And just when it seems like this is purely about institutional mechanics, another layer emerges, because public perception plays a powerful role in shaping how those mechanisms are interpreted, especially when the legacy of Diana, Princess of Wales, continues to hold emotional significance for millions of people. And this is where the narrative becomes more complex, because legacy does not operate under the same rules as structure. It exists in memory, in public connection, and in how people interpret the past, which means that any structural change can carry symbolic meaning far beyond its legal definition. Now pause for a moment and consider this. If institutional authority and public emotion ever move in different directions, which one do you think has the greater long-term influence on the monarchy? Because as insiders continue to analyze this dynamic, one thing becomes increasingly clear: the monarchy survives by balancing those two forces, adapting its structure while maintaining its connection to public sentiment. And that balance is exactly what future monarchs must navigate. And this is where Prince William is often described as preparing for a monarchy that is more focused, more streamlined, and more aligned with modern expectations. A monarchy where roles are clearly defined and where public understanding matches institutional reality. But here's where the story reaches its most important question, because if clarity becomes the priority, then every title, every role, and every position must fit within that vision, and anything that does not align may be subject to change, not out of conflict, but out of structural necessity. Now think about this carefully. If the future of the monarchy depends on clarity and alignment, what kinds of changes do you believe are most likely to happen first? Because as we reach the final moment of this narrative, one thing becomes impossible to ignore: the monarchy is not a static system, it evolves with each reign, and that evolution is driven not just by tradition, but by the decisions of the sovereign who holds the authority to shape it. And just when it feels like everything has been explained, one final truth remains. The power to define the monarchy's future does not sit in headlines, speculation, or public debate. It sits with the person who holds the crown, and when that crown passes to Prince William, the future king, the next chapter will begin instantly. So now the conversation comes back to you, because your perspective matters in understanding how this story could unfold. Do you believe the next era of the monarchy will preserve the current structure, or do you believe it will quietly redefine what royal titles truly mean? And if you want to stay ahead of how these shifts could reshape the roles of Prince William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, King Charles III, and Queen Camilla within the monarchy, make sure you stay connected, because the next development may not just answer questions, it may redefine the entire structure. And if this breakdown helped you see beyond the headlines and understand the deeper system behind royal titles, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below, because in a story shaped by both tradition and change, every perspective adds another layer to what comes next.